Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Fiber Broadband Association's Five for Breakfast. We're now on our 5th episode of 2024. Before we kick off, I'd like to thank Wesco, the platinum sponsor of Five for Breakfast. And, last week, the Department of Education issued its 2024 National Education Technology Plan, which identified 3 key digital divides, limiting the potential of education technology. The first was digital use. Second is digital design, and third is digital access. The plan underscores the importance of high-speed internet to maximize educational opportunities for students and teachers. FBA members are working diligently to build the fiber broadband network that will connect communities, schools, teachers, and students to powerfully learning resources. We'll put a link to this report in the chat. As we've been reporting, the FCC's ACP program is at risk of running out of money by April. There's over 22 million American families that are currently depending on ACP to be able to afford to have access to high-speed broadband service. The FCC has asked Congress for $7 billion to fund the program to the end of the year, and has begun the process of winding down the program. Enrollment for new ACP recipients ends February 7th, and the program is scheduled to end on April 8th if new funding is not appropriate. Our first regional Fiber Connect workshop is coming up on April 8th in Richmond. We have an amazing lineup of speakers, including our good friend Joey Winder from Treasury and former FCC Chair Ajit Pai. Registration for Richmond is now open, but as predicted, we're very, very close to being sold out, so you better register ASAP if you want to attend. In addition to Richmond, we'll be in Little Rock in April, Deer Valley in June, Des Moines in September, Albuquerque in November, and our big Fiber Connect workshop, or conference I'll call it, is in Nashville, July 28th to 31st. This brings us to today's Fiber for Breakfast session with Jim Stegeman, the CEO of CostQuest Associates, to discuss the critical role of broadband fabric and precision data for funding programs. But before I formally introduce today's guest, I'd like to introduce David Norris from our team, who's going to walk us through some housekeeping items.
Great, thank you very much, Gary, and thank you everybody who's joined us today. Before we go over a few logistics, I'd just like to once again thank our platinum sponsor for Fiber for Breakfast, Wesco. Now, if you would all please keep in mind, all participants are in listen-only mode today. To ask a question, please type it into the question box located within your control panel on the side of your screen. We will have a hosted Q&A session with our panelists at the end of today's session. This presentation is being recorded and will be available on FBA's website within 24 to 48 hours. You can find the recording in the Events tab under the Fiber for Breakfast drop-down option. And at the conclusion of today's presentation, you'll be prompted to complete a brief feedback survey. Please take a moment to do so. We appreciate your input. And now I will pass things back over to Gary to introduce our panelists. Thanks.
Thanks, David. Good morning. I'm Gary Bolton, the President and CEO of the Fiber Broadband Association. Last week on Fiber for Breakfast, our guest was Coleman Collins from IonQ Quantum Business Solutions, who discussed hybrid quantum computing. Coleman shared with us how classical and quantum computing can work together to solve some of the world's toughest challenges, and how fiber will be ushering in this new age of quantum networking. Today on Fiber for Breakfast, our guest is Jim Stegeman, the CEO of CostQuest Associates, to discuss the critical role of broadband fabric and precision data funding program. Jim leads a firm of geospatial data scientists, IT, costing, and value experts. He has testified before Congress multiple times and is recognized expert behind the development of the latest generation economic cost models and data use across telecommunications companies and government for broadband deployment analysis and valuation. Jim leads the design and implementation of the fabric location data adopted by the FCC for the National Broadband Mapping effort, which is driving the allocations for the NTIA BEAD program. Jim provides his expertise on the utilization of the fabric to develop national fiber to the premise cost for NTIA. He also leads the design and implementation of the Connect America cost model, which is used in the FCC's CAF program to distribute $1.5 billion annually to fund broadband deployment. So welcome, Jim, and for audience, please type in your questions as we go, and we'll work those in the Q&A at the end. With that, let me turn things over to Jim.
Gary, good morning, and thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure to talk to the group here and walk through what we believe is a critical part of the broadband deployment across the US, which is the fabric, and then how that fabric interrelates with everything. So hopefully we can inform people how it's created and how it interplays with BEAD and other broadband funding programs. So if we go to the next slide. Just a quick introduction of who we are. We were formed in 1999, and we are what we believe the leading geospatial economic experts on broadband networks. We provide data to the FCC, to NTIA, to various states, and to various commercial entities to understand the broadband marketplace. We create targeted product and service solutions, and today we're going to walk through our data, our mapping, our broadband planning, and some of our government advisory support services we provide. What we won't cover today is the work we do on the valuation side. We are recognized as a leading expert on the valuation of broadband networks. Those valuation studies that we produce are used in property tax efforts and in M&A activities. So if you have any interest in that, please let us know and we can get you that as we go through. If you go to the next slide, actually two more. What I'd like to do is start kind of at the end point, which is where we are today with the broadband map and what the FCC produces, and then from that work backwards to how that data gets into the map. So as most of you know, the Broadband Data Act came out in 2020. That Broadband Data Act required the creation of a common set of data set of all locations in the US where fixed broadband internet access service can be installed or where it currently is installed. That act outlined the collection of the broadband coverage data at the location level, which is what the FCC takes care of. They collect that from the ISPs. It outlined the basics for the fabric, which is what we provide. And that fabric was required to contain the geocoded information of each location in the country. And it serves as the foundation not only for the FCC's fabric, but for all federal broadband programs. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. And we'll discuss that as we go through this today. The last thing it kind of hit on was it created the challenge process to make sure that data is as accurate as possible for all the programs that rely on the information. So if you go to the next slide. So let me jump to where we are at with version 3. And this is a confusing chart, but hopefully by the end of me walking through it, it'll help make sense. Where we were with version 2, and if you see the line on there, it says total V2. We had about 115 million locations in the country, and we'll focus on the unserved. We had 8.5 million unserved. So you'll see that 8.5 million in the gray box. That's what we had at the end of version 2, and that's how BEAD was determined and the allocations were made. The FCC then in late last year released version 3 of the broadband data collection effort, which you see on the far right side. And that unserved count went from 8.5 million down to 7.2 million. What happened in between is critical for people to understand. And that's why I put this chart together. One is, as you look at that 8.5 million, and you go up the column, of that 8.5 million, 5.9 million remained as unserved in version 3. 668,000 shifted from unserved to underserved. 1.3 million shifted from unserved to served, and then finally almost 559,000 dropped out. So with the fabric release that we push out every 6 months, there will be new locations coming in, and there will be locations that are dropped based upon our review of the information, based upon changes in structures and everything that we're seeing. So it's important to understand that there are locations that drop. The other column that you see on there is the column labeled new. So in version 3, there were 3 million new locations that came out. And with those locations, there was mapping done by the ISPs of those new locations, 500,000 were identified as unserved. So if you take the 5.9 million that were unserved from version 2, you add in the 503,000, the other changes were changes in coverage. So of the served locations in version 2, 396 locations shifted to unserved, and on the underserved, 410,000 shifted. So net is where you get the 7.2, but it's important to understand where those things come from, and it'll be important for states running their BEAD programs to understand this, because they'll have to incorporate the version 3 coverage into their BEAD efforts to understand which locations need to be served. The bottom part of it is just a sand key diagram that shows that shifting in coverage so that you understand it. And this data is available on our website. If you need information how to get to it, let us know and we can point you to that. If we go to the next slide, actually the next one. So now let me walk backwards to how that information is gathered and developed. So the fabric is what we developed. We released our first version of the fabric in June of 2022. We are now working on version 5. Version 4 was just released at the end of December, and we'll walk through the timing later on. But basically that fabric is based upon hundreds of millions of points, actually closer to billions of points. We apply statistical scoring, AI, crowdsourcing, and other techniques to create what we believe is the most accurate fabric data set available. It's based upon parcels, satellite imagery, commercial footprints, tax attributes, address data sets, and other information. And I'll quickly walk you through how we generate that fabric. If you go to the next slide, and this will be real quick, and I apologize for the speed to go through all this, but the question we're asked is on the left-hand side of the screen. In that image, identify the BSLs, or broadband serviceable locations. Our process first pulls in the parcel boundaries. So those parcel boundaries give us kind of the geographic footprint on which to investigate all the information we collect. Next, the last image on the screen on the right is then we bring in through artificial intelligence, we will scan satellite imagery, aerial imagery to identify the building footprints across the US. Those building footprints are overlaid then with the parcels to help us understand what we're looking at. If you go to the next slide, we then pull in tax assessor information that gives us information on land use, number of units, other critical information in our modeling capabilities to make sure that we are able to accurately represent the fabric. And then the middle one is we bring in address sourcing. That address sourcing one gives you the information to link your address information to the fabric, but it also gives us information to identify units and other critical pieces of the fabric data that we deliver. The final piece is what you see on the right-hand side of the screen, which are the blue dots on the FCC map that I'll show you later. They're green dots, but it's basically the latitude and longitude of each broadband serviceable location in the country. And in the most recently release, we're, up to about 115 million BSLs in the country. If you go to the next slide. So how do we make sure that release to release, we're improving the quality of the fabric? And that's a critical piece of this. We know we need to continue that improvement process. The FCC and Congress saw to it with the challenge process. We also have our own self-challenge process. So if you go to the next slide, what we do is in concert with the FCC challenge, we run our own internal self-challenge process to make sure that each release is improved. And we're happy to announce that in version 4, which was just sent out at the end of December, we correctly identify parcels with a BSL on it 99.6% of the time, which is an improvement over version 3. We correctly identify the structure on the parcel that is the BSL 99.1% of the time. And then our type 1 and type 2 error rates are approaching 1%. So we think it's a vast improvement over where with version 1, and we will continue to improve this as we roll forward with future releases. How do we get to that? Let me go to the next slide. So the first part of the process is the FCC challenges. The FCC has 8 specific challenges, as you see on the left-hand side of the screen. The primary challenge that has been filed by parties is a type 1 challenge, which is a missing BSL. Those missing BSLs come in, or challenges come into the FCC. The FCC runs an adjudication process in which they visually inspect most of those to identify if there's actually a missing BSL that needs to be added. And as you see in that table on the right, these are based upon statistics released by the FCC. Most of those type 1 challenges are actually rejected. It's about a 10% to 15% acceptance rate of that. The rest fall to the floor. However, as they fall to the floor, we may farm some of the address information and other information that comes through to help on future releases. The other types of challenges, type 2 through 8, are much less frequent. The most frequent of those is mostly the address change and the elimination of a BSL. But again, those are small in count, and for the most part, most of those are accepted as they come through. So that's on the FCC side. On the CostQuest side, what do we do to maintain the quality of the fabric? For each release, we update all of our data sources. We update our linkage between those data sources so that we can improve the overall point quality of how we achieve that. And that's what I showed you in that first slide on our quality. Across versions, we inspect about 600,000 to 800,000 records with each release visually. Those are records in which our confidence in the outcome isn't where we'd like it to be. So we want human eyes on that to verify whether it is or is not a BSL. We continue to look at sourcing additional footprints, improving addresses, improving our exclusion zones. So we've had, there have been parties that come forward that say we've identified a BSL as a boulder or a hay bale. This exclusion zone is our attempt to try and clean out those areas where BSL should not be. And with each release, we continue to look at those areas to make sure we are excluding as much of that noise as possible. And then finally, we're always looking for new sources of information to help drive a much better fabric as we move forward in time. If you go to the next slide. These are the improvements in version 4 specifically. I only hit on one specifically. This deck will be available. You can look at some of the other ones. But primarily in version 4, we are trying to maintain consistency release to release on which location is picked, what location ID is used, so that we don't have a shift, such as a garage was noted in version 3, now it's the house, and we shifted the location, may have changed the location ID. That creates issues downstream for parties. So we're trying to retain consistency as much as possible, release to release. But overall, again, we were trying to make sure that each release we improve that underlying fabric. Go to the next slide. So now let's talk about what that coverage is. So we give this data to the FCC every 6 months. The FCC then has us provide it to all the ISPs and to the states with that 6-month release. So as you look at the next page, this is hopefully most of you have been out to the National Broadband Map. On that map, you key in your address. Again, the green dots are what we provide in the fabric. The right-hand side of the screen, which is the coverage information, is what the FCC collects and represents on each of those points. Very nice map. I think it's exceeded all expectations of the quality and the information it provides to parties. If you go to the next page, there are calendar questions that come up as we walk into the BEAD and state programs that parties just need to be cognizant of, and I'll just hit on 2 critical things. We have just released version 4 of the fabric to the FCC and to the ISPs to conduct their version 4 BDC filings. NTIA just released version 3 of the fabric to the states to run their BEAD program. They were working with version 2 because that's how the allocations were conducted. They then got version 3. So there is some confusion of which release to use, but the critical part is for version 3 and why NTIA is relying on that is it links to the BDC information, the broadband data collection, and the costing information that we generate. Version 4 coverage information won't be available until May, and that's why it's not necessarily applicable to the current BEAD program as states are starting to roll out their volume 2 efforts. If you go to the next slide. One confusing part of the entire effort is the licensing, and we apologize for the confusion, but this data is being used across multiple programs sponsored by multiple entities. And it's critical to understand the FCC license, which is a tier 2, 3, 4, or 4R, is provided by the FCC and allows parties to use that data within FCC efforts, such as their broadband data collection effort, their affordability program reporting, their pre-BDA USF obligation reporting, their post-BDA obligation reporting, such as enhanced ACAM, and then it's allowed for academic research. It is not allowed for use within federal broadband programs such as BEAD or Treasury programs. That FCC data is not permitted for use in those programs. For those programs, you need the NTIA license, which provides access to the fabric, the same fabric for those federally sponsored broadband programs. The issue here is that license can't be used on the FCC. So if you want to work within the FCC programs and the BEAD programs, you need both licenses. Critical thing is for state-sponsored programs which are not using federal funds, neither license is applicable. You need a commercial license through CostQuest. And for carriers who want to use the data internally or for other uses, you need a commercial license. And then finally, if you want to create commercial products from the fabric, you need to contact us about that. If you have questions about licensing, please reach out to us. There'll be contact information with this that you can ask any questions about that licensing. If you go to the next slide. I'll hit on the CostQuest model real quick, the cost model real quick, simply for the fact that the cost model was used by NTIA for the BEAD allocation, and those cost results are provided out to all the states. So if you go to the next slide. It's granular. We provide this information. It's consistent with the FCC's costing effort in Enhanced ACAM, ACAM, and CACM. It is based upon the fabric data. And what we provide at the end point of this is the CapEx and net present value of a fiber deployment to each location in the country, along with the same information for fixed wireless across the country. If you go to the next slide, that model is based upon an efficient build. We're building the full footprint of 115 million locations across the country. The costs are apportioned out using TELRIC concepts. If you have questions about that, again, please reach out to us. And then we produce both the greenfield and brownfield number. The greenfield is if nothing exists. The brownfield assumes that potentially certain portions of the network exist, and we're looking for the incremental investment to get that fiber out. The chart on the right just shows that cost profile of the unserved locations in the country on a location by location basis. Typically, if the investment for fiber is under 2,500, it's more commercially viable than if it's over 2,500. And you'll see the blue dots may be commercially viable, the other colors typically not, and those are in need of greater funding to make carriers, or to allow carriers to come in and achieve broadband deployment in those areas. If you go to the next slide. This data is all available in our CostQuest data broadband fabric data suite on the next slide. That suite just combines all the relevant information. Contact us if you're interested in any portions of that. But if you look at the right portion, the FCC data license gives you that location layer. The NTIA license for states gives the cost and economics out to the states, so they get those two layers. And then for any commercial entity, if you want those layers, you can contact us for that information. If we go to the next slide, we also have an online application called OnLook that provides geographic capability to examine this data, do your own opportunity analysis in a quick and efficient format. It gives you the investment profile, the net present value profile, competitive profile, all in an easy to use application. Again, if you're interested, please reach out to us and we can provide information. And now with the last 2 minutes of my discussion, let me jump into the state programs. So on the state program side, if you go to the next slide, the issue that we see is there has to be a balancing act between what states are trying to achieve, which is a return on funding that maximizes the number of BSLs that they can serve with the minimum amount of funding. On the ISP side, they have a return on investment profile that they're trying to ensure that they have a long-term financial viability of serving those new locations. So it's a balancing effort between the two, and that's where we think our information plays a role in that. It helps at the point location level data, both parties to understand what that economic profile looks like so that efficient programs can be instituted. If you go to the next slide. So as we help states through their volume 2 implementation and development, and as we've helped states in the past with their programs, the first thing you have to come up with is the coverage. This has to be filed with NTIA for NTIA approved. It would seem somewhat straightforward, but what we found it is not. First, you get your version 2 coverage. From that, you run your state challenge process. You incorporate that. You then have to identify the locations with an enforceable commitment so that you can deduplicate and not fund locations that have already been funded. And then to add to the complexity, now with version 3 of the fabric out and about 15% of the unserved locations removed, you want to incorporate that in. But in doing that, you've also got these new locations being added and other locations being dropped. So you just need to make sure you manage that process to come up with the coverage layer that creates the eligible locations for your BEAD program. As you do that, you also need to set up the guidelines for your program, which are, what are the key attributes you want to achieve? What are the grant areas? How do sub-grantees qualify for this? How do you define funding levels? Do you or do you not? How do you identify your extremely high cost threshold approach? And then how do you define your scoring criteria? Those are all captured in your volume 2. Once you do that and you set those guidelines, then you have to run the program. So if you go to the next slide, as we're helping states through this effort, the first critical thing is kind of trying to come up with the project areas or sub-project areas. These are simply clusters of eligible locations that are eligible for BID. They typically are an aggregation of served, or unserved and underserved. And what parties have done is they're using a combination, or they're using either census definition or location definition. The census definition, I've seen some states using counties, census blocks or census block groups. On the location side, I've seen, and we're helping states through using either location clustering or hex cell clustering. We think that location hex cell provides greater flexibility and greater economic ties to the cost and profile. Once you do that and you create your project areas, you then capture the financials in those areas that if you want to set a target value of what parties are allowed to receive in that area, you can, or you can use those financials to understand as the bids come in whether they're reasonable or not. The other thing you can do is consider other social, economic, environmental, or tribal information that you want to capture in those project areas. And then the final thing, on the next slide, is then once you do all that, you identify the project areas, you've published your eligible locations, you've identified the relevant funding available, and you've published your rules, then you run your program. We are in the process of implementing a grant management program for one of the early states. And in that, we've developed the program such that it anonymizes all bidders. So there are no names captured in the system to avoid any potential bias. We encode all the rules in volume 2 within that, so it automates the scoring. It provides quality control. We run mock auctions and sample dry runs so that the state and the participants know how the application works so that when the round opens, they can come in and intelligently enter their bids, and then the state can run their program. The final thing it has to do is work on bid deconfliction. And what that is there is potential overlap between bidders. How do you score and award bids or award out when there is this confliction? And that's what this grant management platform will work through. And then finally, it will provide the information for reporting. So it was a quick run through today of a lot of information from the start to the end of where we're at now. Hopefully it's been informative, and I look forward to the questions to come.
Well, Jim, we definitely had the most bang for the buck on information per minute. So you densely packed here. But so let me start with, if I look at kind of the biggest concern that I have, first of all, the maps are so much better than they were in the past. This whole census block so much better, and every version is getting more and more better. So now we're down to, roughly with version 3 of the BCD, we're down to 10.2 million unserved and underserved. Yeah. And Cartesian's latest study was saying that, well, if you put the inputs from the other programs, that will come down, bring that down to 6.4 million unserved and underserved locations. And so they're estimating that with the available BEAD funding and the match, we should be able to get up to 86% of those locations, all the 100% locations served, and 86% of those served with fiber. Does that match with your estimates?
We might be potentially a little bit higher, and it depends. It's more state driven. There will be states that should be able to achieve a much higher percentage. It's likely the western states will struggle because that's where a lot of the high cost locations are centered and where the BEAD money may be deficient in funding those programs to an extent. And I think that's where management of the extremely high cost threshold can alleviate some of that and to allow as much fiber to be built with the funds as possible. But our numbers are probably a little bit higher than 86%.
So you think we can get much better than that with fiber then? That's fantastic. Yeah, because like, for instance, we'll be in Virginia next week, and the Cartesian estimates that Virginia has enough money, BEAD money, to be able to get 100% fiber to all the unserved and underserved and still have 112 million left over for adoption and other programs. So one of the things
part of what we found is that some of these locations that are eligible, they're small pockets in suburban and urban areas that the amount of funding required should be minimal to get to those locations. So hopefully it's more of a line extension that doesn't necessarily require all the CapEx that would be required to get to that location by itself.
So one of our latest working groups is on precision agriculture. So in addition to the applications you described and how CostQuest data can be used, can you envision your data helping precision ag?
Oh yeah, we are looking to expand our AI capabilities and data that we have to better identify barns, silos, chicken houses, irrigation pivots. All those things are typically, we're capable to identify what they are so that we can expand the locational data set to include some of those points within the data set to have it available. The other part is we can overlay crop information at a fairly fine geographic level to understand where croplands are, where pasture lands are, to incorporate that in as well to make sure that we're able to provide not only point level information, but polygon level information about agricultural lands within that data set.
All right, and just on the BEAD, the last question here, but I mean, we're building out critical infrastructure for elevate generations to come, right? And it really worries me when states look at fixed wireless. How are they going to be able to, the state's going to be able to use your information to really, it's not just about getting a box tick saying we got covered, but make sure that we have the critical infrastructure for generations to come. So how can they use their data to really make sure that they're maximize their fiber investment?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, in part, what we view our data is kind of a cross-check against what parties will come in and ask for in grants. So it gives states kind of a background information of what to expect to manage efficiently how much money is provided out to each of the locations for which fiber is being built to, so that they don't overspend, but rather efficiently spend on those locations to further stretch the budget so that they can go up the cost curve to get more of the location in the higher portion of the cost curve served by being more efficient on the lower part of the cost curve.
Well, Jim, I mean, it's just impressive on how you keep this. I mean, our national broadband maps went from a disaster to now it just gets better, better, better. So thanks for sharing your expertise and knowledge and all the work that you and your team are doing to really build better and better broadband, national broadband maps. And I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I look forward to getting back together next Wednesday. We're going to be speaking with Ned Brody, the partner at Foundry.ai, to discuss Artificial Intelligence 101, separating the hype from the practical. You're not going to want to miss that. So thanks again, and we'll see everybody in Richmond on February 8th. So thanks, everyone. Thanks, Gary.
Thanks all.